Welcome to part 2 of the Merlin Chronicles. This is going to be a short one because I just want to conclude up to Merlin's astrology chart. Had a senior moment there. I wanted to call it a soul chart because I used to do these ancient Lemurian images and then read them, and they were called soul charts, or that's what I call them. That was many, many, many years ago. And for some reason, that's what popped into my head to say, but no, it's an astrology chart. And so, we will return to Meerth in a moment. Now remember, Meerth from the last video was Merlin's grandson. So I'm saying we will return to Meerth in a moment, but it should be mentioned that Merlin had grandchildren other than Ion's son. And remember, Ion was the one that was the son of the priestess of the Dark Queen, and so he was kept from Ion for a long time, and Ion was never entirely friendly with him, but finally he decided to let him, for whatever reason, to let him know his grandson, Merlin, to know his grandson. So, and that's where Meerth came into the picture. But now he's saying, or the book is saying, that to remember that Merlin had more than just Ion's son as a grandson or grandchild. One of special importance to our chronicles was Carmarthen, son of Mercedes of Dora and Succat, or Patricus, who would become, in historical perspective, St. Patrick of Ireland. Now, here we come to this. History tells us that St. Patrick was not a nice guy. He persecuted mercilessly people who were not quote unquote Christians. And so he has a very bad rep. All I can tell you is that Thoth doesn't see it that way. And obviously Thoth wouldn't approve of all the horrible things they say Patrick did. So, all I can say is either Thoth's addressing an alternate reality, or, history is written by the victors. So take it whatever way, but I'm just going to give you what I received here. Let's see, okay, I lost my place already. According to Thoth, Patricus's parents were killed in a fire when he was a small child, and his Celtic pagan grandmother raised him. She was a member of the Eye of the Fawn, and Patricus, or as he was called then, Succat, formed a close bond with Merlin's daughter. As a young man, he left his grandmother and the grove circle of Merlin behind, but after his captivity and enslavement in Ireland, he returned to the Isle of Man to visit the grave of his grandmother. It was then that he reestablished friendships with Merlin and his grove folk, which stirred in Patricus old embers of ancient beliefs. He stayed 3 years with Mercedes, leaving her with their child Carmarthen. Can't say it, Carmarthen. There was no bitterness in parting, as Mercedes, a priestess in her own right, foresaw Patricus's true destiny and urged him to pursue it. Mercedes had intended that Carmarthen be born in Bannockhill, Scotland, but her son entered the world on a winter solstice in a stone circle on the Isle of Skye. Our path turns once again to Meerth. He worked closely with his grandfather from the age of 14 until his death at 38. Several weeks before he was to depart the Meerth identity, he was cast into a sea of love, as his grandfather had been with the beautiful Maria. Meerth's young maiden was another Elaine, related to but not the same soul as the Ionian priestess of ages past. She was the daughter of King Pelles of the castle Carbonek, which at a certain period in the Merlin era housed the Grail Cup and original texts of the Grail Mysteries. And when we're speaking of a Grail Cup here, the Grail is many things. but they're all related to the source of being the vessel of the Christic consciousness. In the sense of the Grail cup, we had an original little cup that Jesus drank out of, a little clay cup or whatever, and it was housed in a beautiful, vessel, golden, whatever, that was fancy. And that is what would have probably been housed in this particular castle. Elaine was a lily maid, meaning that she served the goddess and had been instructed at the convent of Shoreham up to a certain initiatory level. Like Meredith, she was the descendant of Joseph of Arimathea. A week after his physical union with Elaine, Meredith underwent the initiation of the serpent and died by its poison. This act purified the strain of the Dark Queen that this good and gentle soul had carried as a burden within him. He was then ready to accept the gauntlet of purity passed to him by the Shining One, and his soul entered the womb of his love Elaine. So Meredith became his own son, Ban, later baptized as Galahad. Now, let's take a look at this for a moment. I don't know the circumstances by which Meredith had got bitten by the serpent, but I'm sure he didn't intend it as a suicide. And perhaps he just was walking along and boom, the serpent bit him. What Thoth is addressing here is a higher reasoning. It's not a curse. It's not that some kind of magical thing where you get bitten by a serpent and your karma is cleared. It's nothing like that. He's speaking of it as a dimensional, interdimensional, holographic picture of reality and how these things work. And possibly the serpent, sorry, dry throat. Let me try this again. So possibly the serpent bite, or the serpent itself, was, shall we say, inhabited by a force that was impelled by the soul of Meredith to complete that incarnation. Not something that came in and said, okay, boy, your time is done here, boom, I'm going to get you out. No, not that kind of a thing. But the soul impels the situations in life. Why do some people, buy a plane ticket and all of a sudden I just can't go now, I've got this to do or that, and they cancel a plane trip, and 300 of the passengers don't cancel the plane trip and they all die and the one person lives. It's not a punishment. It's not really karma in the sense of gnarly stuff necessarily. There's a much broader picture and understanding of how these things work. And we aren't at the mercy of the guy with the sickle, We aren't at the mercy of death or when we're going to be taken into the other world. We are a part of the production, and we have a say in how things work. So Meredith's soul devised the serpent and the serpent bite to bring him into a consciousness as he passed that allowed him to vanquish whatever strains in the DNA that were placed there as archonic forces or whatever through the Dark Queen. This DNA strain was imperative that he release those bondages in his DNA so that the preceding generations from his spawn, so to speak, would be free of that inclination. Okay, so I have a little quote here from Corinne Helene's Mysteries of the Holy Grail. Galahad in the Vulgate is the name of the great-grandson of Joseph of Arimathea and is the same as Gilead, Numbers 26-29, Judges 10-18. His lineage is obscure on his father's side, but through his mother he descends from the bishop in Christendom, Joseph of Arimathea. A legend states that Galahad's father was a fiend who attacked a holy nun, and that the infant of this union was taken by the convent and reared to young manhood until the time to send him to King Arthur's court. Another legend has it that Sir Lancelot was his father and Elaine daughter of King Pelles of the castle of Carbonek, was his mother. Now I'm saying there is a close similarity between the fiend and the nun of Galahad's story and Merlin's conception in legend supposedly having taken place between a demon and a mortal woman who fled and took refuge in the sanctuary. Both these stories relate the stigma that Merlin and his grandson Murith bore. The former's father had turned to evil forces. The latter's grandmother served the Dark Queen. Yet Merlin's, that's Merlin, father would be washed clean of his transgressions in the last moment of life, and Murith's grandmother, while not entirely converted to the light, would cease to be active in dark works long before her death. While Lancelot was not the true father of Galahad, he became his father in spirit and served as a guiding force in Galahad's youth. Elaine was indeed a holy nun while serving in the convent of Shoreham, where even the attire was a facsimile to the Christian habit. When I say facsimile, I don't mean they were all wrapped up and bound like they were in the olden days, nuns were, but there was a certain, look about it. It was through Galahad that much of the original plan was completed, for in him was the blood of Galatane, and it was he who would redeem the Holy Grail for the spiritual rebirth of a future age. Of course, here we're not talking about redeeming a cup. The cup may have been a symbolic, and to some degree had contained, in its light codes, the essence of the Grail consciousness, the logos, if you will. The same logos that has been recently transferred from Utenberg Mountain to Mount Blanca here in San Luis Valley. That's another video that I've made recently about that. But the point is that they're speaking here not of just a cup. They're speaking about the whole Grail logos consciousness, or not even consciousness. That wouldn't be the right word. The Grail logos. I almost want to use the word oversoul. Of course, that's not right either. But it's an over picture. It's an over a canopy of light dimension that holds the focus of what Thoth refers to as the Grail, which is the divine Christos solvency within the pageantry of the Christ in the earth. And so, Merlin's part as the genetic engineer is touched upon in Gareth Knight's The Secret Tradition in Arthurian Legend, and I quote from this book here. Merlin's aim was the selection and interbreeding of particular bloodlines that would be the basis for founding an aristocratic line of priest-kings after the old Atlantean model. The particular qualities of blood would be such as to make available a refined type of clairvoyance that would enable easier contact between ruling families or class and the inner plane guides behind the nation. This is the basis for the conception of the sang real, the royal blood of the Holy Grail. At a much later date, it took on a higher individualized form as the attainment of individual conscious expression of the innermost spiritual powers in the physical body. Well, I would say that he really doesn't take it quite far enough back. I'm not disagreeing with what Mr. Knight has written here, but I'm simply saying that if you take it a little further back and you fill in the dimensions a bit, you will find, the first Grail messenger, the one who embodied the Grail codes, being the Lord Melchizedek from Venus, who was also layered with Thoth. Thoth gets around and came to Earth, bringing that heritage and that lineage, and the Grail family sprung out of that in Atlantis, and then, of course, migrated to Europe via many of them through the Mazur, the most prominent strand, migrated to through the Canary Islands. That's not what they're called originally, but it's escaping me right now. And then on to Europe, and actually, into Asia to some degree. Now I've forgotten what I was reading. Oh, yes. So anyway, it's a bigger picture than that, but it does encompass what Mr. Knight is saying here. And what of Merlin? And now I'm saying, this is from my book now. And what of Merlin suspended in his crystal cave? His fate lay in the form of Enemu, a priestess of Dinas, a god also known as Dionysus, a somewhat ambivalent image who played both sides of the field. Mr. Knight hits the nail squarely on the head when he writes, and this is quoting Gareth Knight, there is no mere infatuation. This is no mere infatuation of a magician for a fairy maid. It is a great and preordained work of redemptive magic. Similarly, Merlin's disappearance from the earth into the world behind outer nature is no falling under a false enchantment, but a deliberate sacrificial and sacramental act. And this is really important because these people, Merlin and Arthur and Thoth, even in his incarnation in Earth, but you know, they represent us. So we have things happen in our life that are not necessarily a falling under a false enchantment, but a deliberate sacrificial and sacramental act. I'm not saying everybody does in the lifetime that they're living right now, but in your soul progression, in all the lifetimes you've lived, you've had experiences that would qualify as this. Maybe not so dramatic and all-encompassing and spiritually global in its impact and all of this, but it does represent an aspect of that. And you probably have had little minute experiences with this type of thing in your life. And you said to yourself, oh, what did I do that? Oh, that was so, I know better now, but that was just, I was, you know, and you go on and on about it. And yet maybe that wasn't the case. Yeah, maybe you just lesson you had to learn and whatever, maybe, yeah. A lot of times we have that. Most of the times we have that. But this does happen in everyday people's lives on some level. So I'm going to read it again. Merlin's disappearance from the earth into the world behind outer nature is no falling under a false enchantment, but a deliberate sacrificial and sacramental act. And again, I'm not making this a scapegoat for, or not, scapegoat isn't the right word, but an excuse for our mistakes in life. I'm just saying that this does happen. And one needs to evaluate or perhaps reevaluate when in certain instances in your life, this possibly could be the reason it occurred. Surely Mirth's initiation of the serpent was an equally sacramental act. Thoth tells me that Merlin's energy was and is of that of initiating humanity's reawakening of their bonds with the earth, and the innate power they possess to interact with and control the natural world. Merlin's testing is also that of self-control and wisdom, which must be acquired before mastership in the light is achieved. Through these virtues, the resources of the earth are guided towards syntropy, or a centering entrainment with the universal rhythms, rather than being manipulated by false desire into entropy or breakdown of the holistic matrix. When the initiate becomes a master or co-creator of the elemental world, he must detach himself or herself from karmic self-involved will in order to impress his service into the design of the grand logos of creation. The crystal cave is that sanctuary of isolation which brings about self-confrontation and inward God communion. Being a communal creature, mankind is not generally comfortable in his aloneness, for he tends to see himself through others rather than the eye of the God self. The sealing away of Merlin by the archetypal Lilith, dark moon female, was a necessary aspect of the dark light redemption principle we have seen as a major theme of these chronicles. Little Nemu, while a fence-sitter, was not an evil personage. She was merely a tool for the dark forces with her weak will, ignorance of the great difference between good and evil, and her natural powers that could be applied to either side. In this way, she resembled Ru, grandmother of Mirth. Yet in both instances, dark was made to serve the light. Merlin's isolation was a period of gestation and renewal, not for himself, but for the aspect in the racial mind which its archetype assumes. Like the Master Jesus, Merlin knew what his fate would be while still in his mother's womb. Turning page. Everything's so creaky in this book, sorry. It is the ritual slaying of the Sun King to arise with new life in a future age, infusing the new race with life from the old wells of our creation, those bloodlines carrying the alchemy of our root tribes. And there's an asterisk here, and I'm going down to where it says, the Atlantean concept of genetic engineering to which Merlin and his kind subscribed is not exclusive in the ultimate sense. The concept behind it was a recognition that all peoples were capable of regenerating the quote-unquote grail blood within them, and that each race contained the seeds of the new race, the spiritualized being within the cells of the body. And of course, this refers very much, ties into what Thoth calls paragenetics. And I have much material out there on that, so I'm not going to go into it here. But, carrying the genetic energy over from one incarnation to another, not just through the genetic bloodlines. And what Thoth is saying here, or the book is, and large written between me and Thoth, says that those bloodlines carrying, let me go back to this just a moment. It is the ritual slaying of the Sun King to arise with new life in a future age, infusing the new race with life from the old wells of our creation, those bloodlines carrying the alchemy of our root tribes. So, as we continue to procreate on this planet, we are carrying forth not only our physical genetic lines, but our paragenetic lines. And the paragenetic is the balancer factor, especially if we are aware. We don't have to be aware of the word paragenetic and what it means, but I mean aware beings. Then this paragenetic energy is more of an adjuster. How many people have said, why was I born into this family? And of course, I've addressed this before in my videos on paragenetics. Many people come into a genetic lineage to transform it and to carry that transformation, even if they never have any offspring, on into the next. Their fathers and their mothers and their grandparents, they're transforming the whole line by entering in, if they are aware enough to work with it. And they don't have to be metaphysically aware. I'm talking about spiritual core integrity, natural awareness. And of course, also this addresses or links to the whole light program of the Dweller Crystal Skulls, another topic. So now, Merlin's mother was given a special dispensation by the church, annulling her marriage to the demon Hester. Mary Grace accepted this with a heavy heart, for she knew her once beloved was no demon, but a deeply troubled man. Reconciled that she could no longer be a part of his life, she wished to begin anew for herself and her son. With her freedom from Hester, she regained her spiritual strength at Shoreham. In this convent of women, initiated by the goddess and the Christ in a wedding of two spirits, Mary Grace was gradually healed of her emotional wounds. After 3 years' time, Merlin's mother went out into the world again, taking her young son into the strangeness of the Orthodox Christian world. She remarried a Christian named Edsel, like the car, the old Edsel. And when Merlin was 12, she gave birth to his half-sister, Myrtle. It was at the magic age of 13 that Merlin of Galatane made the decision to leave the hearth of his mother and follow his destiny. His fairy blood was too strong a calling within him, mixed in a potion with the Christ wine from the Grail of Armithea. In his sleep, visions arose before him like forgotten phantoms rising from a crescent moon. The sea wind met him with each sunrise as he meditated upon a blood sky, amber clouds trailing above the cauldron of waves. In his waking and sleeping moments, a voice called him home. The sound of this voice was not patient, but urging and restless. It filled him with a sense of his own power, a life force more vital than his boy mind could fathom, but surely present within him as a guiding lantern beacons to the lost soul. And it was thus that Merlin departed from the loving arms of Mary Grace and set upon the course of his star to the threshold of Avalon. He would return on occasion to visit his mother and sister, whom he kept close to his heart, but never would he be a part of their world. When his daughter Mercedes was a young woman, he sent her to live with Myrtle and her husband for a year and a half so that she might learn the perspective of the purely Christian theology. Mary Grace died at sea on a ship bound for her homeland in South Wales. Her husband dead, her son in the land of the fairies, and her daughter married. She was making the journey to her beginnings, and indeed so she arrived there, upon the shore of the kingdom without end. And so that concludes part 2. Now part 3 is going to be the birth chart of Merlin, which is really rather interesting. At least I think so. So until next time.